The airport was packed, just like it always is on a Tuesday afternoon. The air inside the huge terminal felt heavy and smelled like coffee, fast food, and the distinct metallic scent of jet fuel. Thousands of people were rushing from one gate to another. Some were dragging heavy suitcases that bumped against their legs, while others were shouting into their phones, trying to fix business deals or say goodbye to their loved ones before flying off to different parts of the world. It was noisy, chaotic, and frankly, a bit exhausting. In the middle of all this madness, right near the big glass windows overlooking the runways, sat a shiny black grand piano. It was a strange sight to see such a beautiful instrument in the middle of a busy travel hub, but it was put there to calm people down. Usually, only brave travelers or musicians waiting for a flight would sit down to play. On this specific day, a young man with a backpack was sitting on the bench. He looked like a student, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a casual hoodie and jeans. He was actually quite good. His fingers were moving fast across the keys, playing a lively classical piece that cut through the noise of the announcements. A small crowd had started to gather. It's a natural thing in airports, if someone stops moving, everyone else wants to see why. People who were tired of walking stood leaning against their suitcases, watching the young man play. They were tapping their feet and checking their watches, enjoying the brief distraction. The musician was lost in his own world, glad to have something to do during his long layover. He played with a lot of energy, head bobbing slightly to the rhythm. But then, something happened that made the music pause. Out of the sea of rushing people came an elderly woman. She was impossible to miss because she was wearing a long, dark blue habit, the kind that nuns used to wear a long time ago. On top of her head was a stiff white veil that framed her face. She looked very small and fragile next to the tall, modern pillars of the airport. She was using a wooden cane to help her walk, taking very slow, careful steps. Each step looked like it took a lot of effort, as if her legs were hurting her or were simply very tired. The young musician saw her approaching out of the corner of his eye. He didn't stop immediately, but he watched her. He assumed she was just walking past, maybe looking for a place to sit and rest her feet before her next flight. However, she didn't keep walking. She came right up to the edge of the piano. The young player slowed down and eventually stopped playing, letting the last note fade away into the busy air. He looked up at her with a polite smile, expecting her to ask for directions or maybe just say hello. The crowd that had gathered was also curious. They looked at the young man, then at the nun. Some people started to whisper, wondering if she was going to tell him to be quiet or if she needed help. The airport is a place where everyone is in a hurry, and seeing someone move as slowly as she was can sometimes make impatient travelers annoyed. A few people checked their phones, thinking this was just a delay. But the old nun just stood there, looking at the piano keys with a sense of longing in her eyes. She didn't say a word. She just stood there for a moment, catching her breath. Her hands, which were covered in wrinkles and looked very weak, were resting gently on the top of her cane. The young man, sensing that she wanted something, slid over on the bench to make room. He thought she might want to sit down just to rest, away from the walking crowd. "Do you want to sit here?" he asked kindly, gesturing to the empty spot on the bench. The elderly nun nodded her head slowly. A very faint, shy smile appeared on her face. She moved carefully around the bench and sat down. She let out a small sigh of relief as the weight was taken off her legs. For a few seconds, she just sat there, looking out at the hundreds of people rushing by. The young man waited, not sure if he should start playing again or if he should just leave. He stood up, thinking he would give the old lady some space to rest. "It's all yours," he said nicely, turning to walk away into the crowd. But to his surprise, and to the surprise of the people standing nearby, the nun didn't lean back to relax. Instead, she scooted closer to the keys. She adjusted her habit so the sleeves wouldn't get in the way. The young man stopped walking and turned back around. He watched as she slowly raised her trembling hands and hovered them over the black and white keys. The people in the crowd who were still watching exchanged glances. They thought she was just going to play a simple note or maybe try to remember a song from her childhood. They expected it to sound slow, shaky, and maybe a bit out of tune because her hands looked so unsteady. Some people even felt a little bit of second-hand embarrassment, worried that she was about to make a mistake in front of all these people. The noise of the airport seemed to get louder again, the rolling suitcases, the crying babies, the intercom announcements. It felt like the world was ignoring her. But then, her fingers touched the keys. The moment her skin made contact with the ivory, everything changed. It was like a switch flipped inside her. The trembling in her hands vanished instantly. Her back, which had been hunched over with age, suddenly straightened up. Her shoulders went back, and she took a deep breath. She wasn't an old, tired nun anymore. She looked like a master musician preparing for a concert. The young man stood frozen, his eyes wide. He couldn't believe the transformation he was seeing in just a split second. The air around the piano seemed to change, too. The people nearby felt it, a sudden electric tension that made them stop looking at their phones and focus entirely on her. She wasn't there to rest, she was there to play. There was a moment of total silence right before she played. It was that specific kind of quiet that happens when a whole room full of people holds their breath at the exact same time. The elderly nun sat still on the bench, her posture completely different from how it looked just a few seconds ago. Before, she looked like a frail grandmother who might need help crossing the street. Now, her back was straight, her shoulders were pulled back, and her chin was held high. She looked strong, focused, and ready. Her hands, which had been shaking while holding her cane, were now hovering over the keys with steady confidence. It was as if sitting at the piano had given her a sudden injection of youth and energy. The young musician who had been playing earlier hadn't walked away yet. He was standing a few feet back, his backpack hanging loosely off one shoulder. He crossed his arms and leaned against a pillar, watching her closely. He had played enough music to know when someone was a beginner. He expected her to fumble a bit, maybe press a wrong key or play a simple nursery rhyme like Mary Had a Little Lamb. He was ready to be polite and smile, even if the music wasn't very good. But deep down, he was just curious. He wanted to see what this old lady in the religious habit was going to do. The crowd around the piano had grown larger. Travelers who were originally just rushing to their gates had stopped to see what the fuss was about. The scene was unusual, a stark contrast between the modern, noisy airport and this traditional, quiet figure from the past. Some people in the crowd were holding coffees, others were dragging heavy luggage, but all of them were staring at her. A businessman in a suit checked his watch, looking a bit impatient, clearly thinking this was going to be a waste of his time. A mother with a crying baby stopped bouncing the child, using the moment as a distraction. Then, the first note rang out. It wasn't a soft, hesitant tap. It was a strong, deep note that seemed to cut right through the noise of the terminal. Immediately, another note followed, and then another. She wasn't playing a simple, slow tune. She was playing a complex classical piece, and she was playing it fast. The sound coming from the grand piano was rich and full. It filled the space around them, echoing off the high glass ceiling. The young musician's jaw literally dropped. He stood up straight, uncrossing his arms. He recognized the piece instantly. It was technically difficult. It required fingers to move independently of each other, jumping up and down the keyboard at high speeds. He had been practicing similar songs for years, and here was this elderly woman, who could barely walk a minute ago, playing it as if it were the easiest thing in the world. The reaction of the crowd was amazing to watch. At first, people were confused. They looked from the piano to the woman's face, trying to understand what was happening. They were seeing a contradiction that their brains couldn't quite process. Her hands looked old, wrinkled, and bony, with visible veins and spots that come with age. Yet, they were dancing across the keys with the speed and grace of a spider. Her fingers moved with a precision that you only see in professionals. The businessman who had been checking his watch stopped looking at his wrist. His mouth opened slightly, and he forgot all about his meeting. The crying baby stopped crying, fascinated by the loud, rhythmic sounds. The teenager who had been listening to music through headphones took them off to hear better. The circle of people around the piano tightened. Everyone wanted to get a closer look. People started pulling out their phones, not to record a funny accident, but to capture this incredible moment. The phones were held high, recording the wrinkled hands flying over the keys. As the song continued, the music got louder and more intense. She wasn't just hitting the right notes, she was playing with feeling. You could hear the emotion in every chord. It was powerful and dramatic. Her left hand was keeping a steady, driving rhythm, while her right hand was playing melodies that soared up high. She would lean forward into the piano when the music got soft and mysterious, and then sway back when the sound got big and booming. The young man was completely mesmerized. He looked at her face. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't looking at her hands at all. She was feeling the music. A small, peaceful smile played on her lips. She looked like she was in a different world, a world where there was no airport noise, no rushing passengers, and no pain in her legs. It was just her and the music. He realized then that she wasn't just an old lady who happened to know a song. This was someone who had spent a lifetime with music. She had played thousands of hours, maybe millions of notes, to get to this level of skill. You could feel the atmosphere in the terminal changing. The stress of travel, which usually hangs heavy in the air like a thick fog, seemed to lift. For a few minutes, nobody was worried about missed flights or lost luggage. The rushing crowd that was walking past the piano slowed down to a crawl. People who weren't even planning to stop found their feet rooted to the floor. The music was magnetic. It demanded respect. There was a specific section in the song where the tempo got incredibly fast. It was a blur of notes. The young musician knew how hard it was to play that part without messing up. He held his own breath, waiting for a slip, waiting for her to lose the rhythm. But she didn't. She attacked the keys with a fierce energy that defied her age. Her arms moved up and down, her body swaying with the beat. The sound was thunderous yet beautiful. It resonated in everyone's chests. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, broke away from her mother's hand and walked right up to the edge of the piano, staring at the nun's flying hands. The mother moved to grab her back, but then stopped. The child wasn't touching anything, she was just watching, mesmerized by the magic of the performance. The mother smiled and let her watch. It was a moment of pure connection between strangers, all brought together by this mysterious woman. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, the audience was hooked. They weren't just watching a nun play a piano anymore, they were witnessing a master class. The contrast between her appearance and her ability was what made it so special. It reminded everyone watching that you can never judge a book by its cover. This woman, who society might dismiss as just an elderly person needing care, had more talent and fire in her fingers than most people could ever hope to achieve in a lifetime. The airport was usually a place of goodbyes and hellos, but right now, it was a concert hall, and the elderly nun was the star. The music was not just loud, it was aggressive and beautiful in a way that demanded respect from every single person within earshot. The tune she was playing was incredibly fast, full of complicated runs that required her fingers to stretch and jump all over the keyboard. Most people, even those who played piano well, would struggle to keep up with that speed without making mistakes. But her hands moved with a terrifying accuracy. It was like watching a machine that was built perfectly for this one purpose, yet it was housed in the body of a woman who had lived through 8 decades of history. The contrast was shocking to watch. Every time her wrists dipped to strike a low, bass note, the habit on her arm would shake slightly, but her fingers remained rock steady. The sound was echoing through the entire terminal hall. Usually, in an airport, the dominant sounds are the rolling of suitcase wheels on hard floors and the robotic voices announcing flight delays. But now, those noises seemed to fade into the background. The piano notes were crisp and clear, cutting through the air like a knife. The acoustics of the terminal, which were designed for announcements, actually helped the music travel. People standing at gates far away could hear it drifting over the noise of the jet engines outside. It turned a cold, industrial space into something that felt almost holy. The young man who had given up his seat hadn't moved a muscle. He was standing with his mouth slightly open, completely transfixed. As someone who studied music, he knew exactly what he was hearing. He was analyzing the technique in his head, and he couldn't find a single flaw. Her touch on the keys was perfect. She didn't just bang on them, she knew exactly how much pressure to apply to make the piano sing. When she wanted the music to sound angry or intense, she struck the keys firmly. When the melody turned soft and sad, her hands became gentle, caressing the ivory rather than hitting it. He realized that the weakness he saw in her body when she was walking was completely gone. It was as if the music was flowing through her from some other source, bypassing the limitations of her aged body. The crowd around the piano was now massive. It had started with just a few curious people, but now it was a wall of humanity 3 or 4 rows deep. People were standing on their tiptoes, trying to see over the shoulders of others. Some had put their bags down on the floor, forgetting that they were in a rush. A group of security guards, who usually walked around looking stern and keeping order, had stopped nearby. They weren't telling people to move along, they were just watching, listening with their arms crossed, appreciating the talent they were witnessing. Even the airport staff, who spent all day hearing noise and ignoring it, had paused their work to listen. There was a collective feeling of disbelief rippling through the audience. It was the kind of reaction you get when you see a magic trick that you can't explain. People were whispering to each other, asking, "Do you see this and how is she doing that?" The excitement wasn't just because the music was good, it was because the story happening in front of them was so powerful. Here was a woman representing a life of quiet service and humility, dressed in a simple religious outfit, revealing a hidden genius. It shattered every stereotype people might have had about elderly nuns. As she transitioned into the slower, more emotional part of the song, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted again. The fast, flashy notes were gone, replaced by a haunting melody that seemed to hang in the air. The silence from the crowd became absolute. You could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, but that was it. No one was coughing, No one was shuffling their feet. Everyone was afraid that if they made a sound, they would break the spell. The music felt heavy with emotion. It sounded like a memory of a lost love or a sadness that had been carried for a long time. The young musician noticed tears welling up in the eyes of the woman standing next to him. It wasn't a sad song necessarily, but it was so deeply human and so beautifully played that it touched something inside everyone listening. The elderly nun's face was a picture of peace. While her hands were working furiously, her eyes were closed and her expression was serene. She wasn't performing for the crowd, she wasn't looking around for applause or validation. She was playing for herself, or perhaps for something higher than herself. It looked like a form of prayer for her. Every note she played felt like a word she couldn't speak out loud. The intensity of her focus was mesmerizing. She didn't seem to care that hundreds of strangers were filming her with their phones. For those few minutes, the technology, the airport, and the modern world didn't exist. It was just her and the instrument. The physical exertion was beginning to show, however. Toward the end of the piece, the music became complex again, requiring a lot of force. A vein in her forehead became visible, pulsing slightly with the effort. Her breathing became heavier, rising and falling in time with the music. But she didn't slow down. If anything, she played with more power. She was pouring every ounce of energy she had left into these final moments. It was inspiring to witness. The young man felt a surge of respect for her. It was clear that this wasn't just a hobby she had picked up last week. This was a master at work, someone who had dedicated her life to art before dedicating it to her faith. When she finally played the last few chords, she didn't just stop. She built them up, making the sound huge and resonant, filling the entire space with vibration. Her hands came down on the keys with final authority, ringing out the last notes. Then, she lifted her hands off the keyboard and held them suspended in the air for a brief second. The silence that followed was heavy. The sound of the piano faded away, leaving a ghost of the melody in everyone's ears. For maybe 5 or 10 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stood there, frozen by the beauty of what they had just heard. It was one of those rare moments where time seems to stand still, and a random Tuesday afternoon turns into a memory that will last forever. The young man let out the breath he had been holding, realizing that he had just witnessed something truly miraculous. The silence that hung in the air after the last note faded away was heavier than anything the airport had ever experienced. It was a thick, electric quiet that seemed to vibrate against the glass walls of the terminal. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The businessman holding his coffee forgot to take a sip. The mother who had been shushing her baby stood perfectly still. It was as if the entire concourse was under a spell, waiting to see what would happen next. The young musician stood closest to the piano, his eyes wide, his mind racing to process the level of talent he had just witnessed. He knew that what he had heard wasn't just good, it was the kind of mastery that takes a lifetime to achieve. Then, the spell broke. A young man near the back started clapping. Slowly at first, just a few slaps of his hands together, and then faster. Almost instantly, the entire terminal erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite, clapping you get after a speech type of applause. It was loud, raucous, and filled with genuine emotion. People were whistling, cheering, and shouting words of encouragement. Some had tears in their eyes as they clapped, visibly moved by the unexpected beauty they had found in the middle of their stressful travel day. The sound of the applause was deafening, echoing through the gates and corridors, drawing even more people over to see what the commotion was about. The elderly nun sat on the bench for a moment, her hands resting calmly in her lap, She looked surprised by the reaction. A shy, humble smile spread across her face, turning her rosy cheeks a deeper shade of pink. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the crowd, but she didn't bask in the glory. She didn't stand up to take a bow or wave to the cameras like a pop star. Instead, she looked down at her lap, almost as if she were embarrassed by all the attention. She seemed to be quietly saying a prayer of thanks, keeping her focus internal despite the chaos happening around her. The young musician finally found his voice. He stepped closer to the bench, leaning down so he could be heard over the noise. He had to ask. He had to know who this woman was. That was incredible, he stammered, still a bit breathless from watching her performance. You play professionally. You have to. I've never seen technique like that. The nun looked up at him. Her eyes were bright and clear, filled with a gentle kindness that instantly put him at ease. She shook her head slowly. Oh, no, not anymore, she said softly. Her voice was quiet and raspy, the voice of an elderly woman, yet it carried a distinct warmth. I haven't played on a stage like this in a very, very long time. A woman in the crowd, holding a phone up to record the moment, shouted out, "How long has it been? You're too good to be hidden away." The nun chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that was full of joy. She adjusted her veil and looked out at the sea of strangers. Well, she began, her voice gaining a little strength. I suppose it has been 50 years or more since I last played for an audience. The murmur that went through the crowd was instant. People looked at each other with wide eyes. 50 years, that meant she hadn't played professionally since before many of them were even born. The young musician was shocked. He knew that keeping up that level of skill required daily practice, but to play with that much fire after decades away from the spotlight was unheard of. I was a concert pianist when I was young, she continued, looking down at her wrinkled hands as if she was seeing them for the first time. I traveled all over. I played in the big halls in Vienna, in London, in New York. Music was my whole life. It was all I cared about. She paused for a moment, a look of nostalgia washing over her face. She was remembering the bright lights, the fancy dresses, and the roar of applause from a different lifetime. So what happened? A young girl asked, stepping forward. She looked genuinely confused. Why did you stop? The nun's smile softened. It became a look of deep peace. I found a different calling, she explained simply. I fell in love with the music, but then I fell in love with something deeper. I realized that I wanted to serve God, and I wanted to serve people who had nothing. So, I left the stage. I put away my fancy gowns and I traded them for this habit. She gently tugged at the sleeve of her dark blue dress. I joined my convent to teach children and to care for the sick. I promised to live a simple life, away from the applause and the fame. I haven't owned a piano in decades. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical weight. The silence returned, but this time it was a respectful silence. Everyone looked at her with a new level of reverence. They realized they weren't just listening to a talented old lady, they were listening to a woman who had sacrificed her career and her passion for a higher purpose. She had given up the adoration of fans to live a life of humility and service. And yet, here she was, 50 years later, and the talent was still there, burning as bright as ever. It hadn't gone away just because she stopped performing publicly. It was a part of her soul. I just saw the piano sitting here, she said, gesturing to the grand instrument. And it looked so lonely. I thought, perhaps just for a few minutes, I could visit an old friend. I didn't mean to cause such a scene. You didn't cause a scene, the young musician said earnestly. You made a lot of people very happy. You reminded us that magic still exists. The nun reached out and gently patted the young man's hand. Music is a gift from God, she said softly. It doesn't belong to us. We just have to let it flow through us. Whether it is for 1,000 people in a concert hall or for a few tired travelers in an airport, the music is the same. It is meant to heal. The people around the piano were nodding. They felt the truth in her words. Many of them had been stressed, angry about delays, or tired from work trips. But in that short 10-minute performance, she had healed their anxiety. She had given them a moment of pure beauty that they would never forget. The applause started up again, softer this time, more like a warm hug than a loud celebration. People began to slowly disperse, but not with the hurried, angry energy they had before. They were smiling at each other. Strangers were making eye contact and nodding, sharing a secret connection. The young musician helped the nun stand up. She groaned slightly as her knees popped, the reality of her age returning now that the music had stopped. She gripped her cane tightly, her strength fading back into her frail body. It was a stark reminder of the miracle they had just witnessed. For those few minutes, she had been young again, carried by the wings of the music. But now, she was just an old lady needing support to stand. Thank you, the young man whispered to her. Really? Thank you for stopping. And thank you for letting an old lady play, she replied with a wink. It was lovely to meet the keys again. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and turned to walk away. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, creating a wide path. No one was going to rush her. No one was going to bump into her. She walked slowly down the center of the terminal, a solitary figure in a dark habit, clutching her wooden cane. But to everyone watching, she wasn't just a nun anymore, she was a legend walking among them. As the elderly nun walked away, the atmosphere in the terminal didn't just go back to normal immediately. It felt like the air had been charged with something special, something electric that lingered even after the source of the magic had disappeared. The crowd slowly began to break apart, but nobody was rushing anymore. The frantic energy that usually defines an airport, the sharp shouting into phones, the angry sighing at security lines, the aggressive speed walking had completely dissolved. It was replaced by a quiet, shared sense of wonder. The young musician stood by the piano for a long time, just looking at the empty bench. He felt different. He had been so focused on his technique, his own career, and the stress of trying to make it in the music world that he had forgotten why he started playing in the first place. Watching her, he realized that music wasn't about being perfect or showing off. It was about truth. It was about opening your soul and letting everything pour out, regardless of who was watching. He felt a renewed sense of purpose in his own fingers, a desire to play with that kind of honesty, not just to impress people. People around him were sharing similar feelings. The businessman, who had been impatient and annoyed just 20 minutes ago, was now putting his phone away. He wasn't checking his emails anymore. Instead, he stood tapping his foot against the floor, humming the tune she had played. He had a distant look in his eyes, perhaps remembering a time when he was passionate about something other than money. A few travelers were hugging each other, strangers brought together by the emotional weight of the performance. It was strange how a 5-minute song could break down the walls that people build between themselves. The young man eventually looked around and saw that the piano looked lonely again. It was just a large piece of wood and wire sitting in the middle of a busy hallway. But now, it felt like a sacred ground. He walked back to the bench, but he didn't sit down. He knew he couldn't play right now. Nothing he could play would sound as good as what just happened. He placed his hand gently on the polished wood, feeling the cool surface. It was his way of saying thank you to the instrument and to the woman who had brought it to life. Slowly, reality began to creep back in. The airport intercom crackled to life, announcing a boarding call for a flight to a different city. The spell was finally breaking. The crowd of onlookers started to drift away, heading toward their gates with smiles on their faces. They didn't look tired anymore, they looked energized. As they walked off, the conversations weren't about complaints or delays. Everyone was talking about the nun. "Did you see her hands?" one woman whispered to her companion as they walked toward the baggage claim. "They looked so weak, but the sound was so powerful." "I've never heard anything like that," the companion replied, shaking her head in disbelief. "And she's a nun, a real nun. I wonder who she was before she joined the convent. She must have been famous." That was the question on everyone's mind. Who was she really? She had no name tag, no entourage, and no publicity team. She was just a humble servant of God who happened to possess one of the world's greatest gifts. The young musician realized that was the most beautiful part of the story. She didn't play for fame. She didn't play to get rich. She played because she loved it, and because she felt a moment of inspiration. She gave that gift freely to a room full of strangers, expecting absolutely nothing in return. He thought about her life story. She had been a rising star, a woman who likely stood on stages where thousands of people paid money to see her. She had known applause, adoration, and the thrill of success. But she had given all of that up. She chose a life of silence, prayer, and service. She traded the bright lights of the concert hall for the quiet halls of a convent. And yet, as she walked away with her cane, hunched over and slow, she seemed more complete than any rock star he had ever seen. She proved that you don't need an audience to be great. You just need to be true to yourself. The security guards, who had stopped to listen, were back at their posts, but they were chatting amiably. Even they looked less rigid. The event had humanized the place. For a brief moment, the airport wasn't a machine for processing people, it was a community center where a miracle had taken place. The young musician picked up his backpack, swinging it over one shoulder. He felt lighter than he had when he arrived. He decided he wasn't going to play any more music today. He felt that nothing he could do would follow such an act of genius. Instead, he would just remember the lesson he learned. He watched the path where she had walked, heading toward Gate B. She was probably long gone, disappeared into the stream of passengers. She might be sitting at a gate right now, drinking a cup of tea or reading a book, looking like just another elderly traveler. But everyone who saw her play would remember her for the rest of their lives. The terminal was filling up again with new people who hadn't seen the performance. They rushed past, dragging suitcases, stressed and unaware of what had just happened. They looked at the young man standing by the piano and wondered why he was smiling. He looked at them and realized that the story would now travel. The people who saw it would tell their friends. They would tell their families when they got home. They would say, "You won't believe what happened at the airport today." The story of the piano nun would spread, becoming a legend, a small beacon of hope in a chaotic world. As he finally turned to leave, walking in the opposite direction of where she went, he felt a sense of gratitude. Traveling can be lonely and tiring. It's easy to feel like just a number in a system. But today, amidst the noise and the rush, humanity broke through. A quiet, elderly woman reminded everyone that beauty exists in the most unexpected places. She didn't need a stage to shine, she only needed a moment. The young man walked toward his gate, his step a little bouncier, his heart a little fuller. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. In fact, he was sure he wouldn't. But that was okay. The music was over, but the feeling remained. And as he disappeared into the crowd, just another traveler on a Tuesday afternoon, he carried the music with him, knowing that sometimes, the most extraordinary moments come from the most ordinary people. The airport was back to its noisy self, the intercoms blaring and the crowds rushing, but underneath the noise, a silent memory remained, frozen in time, left by a nun who played the music of the angels.